Hello everybody, I hope you're all having an amazing day. It is Wednesday, which means we're continuing with our Endgame series, and it's going to be the final episode, which means we're going to be covering Rooks and Queens, the most complicated part of any sort of Endgame training. Not because of really the amount of positions you need to know, but the really minute differences between each of the positions. That could be the difference between winning, losing, or drawing, and you, the player, need to know every single one of them if you want to get the right outcome of every single game. But that's a lot to take in, so I've just sort of tried to simplify all of the basic sort of end games you might possibly need in your chess career into one little quick video, just like we have with the other pieces. So without further ado, let's just hop in straight into the first example. So the first couple examples we have here today are going to be about how rooks interact with passed pawns and if it's actually possible for them to be stopped. So what we have to decide here, what is going to be the outcome of this endgame. We see white is up 4 points of material against the passed pawn, but this passed pawn is incredibly dangerous. So what is white's plan? They are probably actually trying to swap off this rook for the passed pawn. I don't think there's any way white could ever win this, and we'll go through this now. So let's say it's black's move, but it doesn't particularly matter whose move it is. Black's just going to go to either c2 or e2. Now this again doesn't particularly matter because the whole idea is that you're threatening to promote your pawn. Because the king's also controlling the promotion square as well, it means that if the promotion happens, when the rook takes, the king can just take straight back. So white could here decide to either just swap off the pawn and take the draw, or they could keep trying and keep playing with a c8 check. So now the king has to sort of decide, what's it want to do? Does it want to... It can go anywhere, really, apart from the c file. Where's it going to go? Now, if it goes back, you're sort of left with a weird situation because it's the same position. But it's actually white up a tempo here. It's white's move. So white can actually slowly get their king into the game. Now, this isn't instantly losing, but if you do this enough times, the white king will slowly work its way in, and that's going to be winning. But you've still got several moves until that happens, so you can keep threatening the same sort of things and fix your mistakes. But if you just decide to go back, you're still threatening the promotion, actually, and white can't do anything about that. So they actually have to go back to d8 here. And here, black king just goes back to c2. And you can see how this will be a really easy repetition for black to make. And white can try some other things. Oh, gosh. White can try some other things, like maybe go back, but then you're losing control of the promotion square, and it's actually going to be potentially even winning for black. So it's important here. White just has to understand that it's going to be a draw if the pawn's far enough, and your king's far enough as well. If you can get your king in, then you're probably going to be able to win the pawn. But in this scenario, the king's too far away to actually make any sort of difference. Now, we know that once a pawn gets onto the second rank, it's extremely scary for the attacker, I guess, would be the piece with the rook. The side with the rook, let's say. So how do you actually stop this situation from happening? Now, as we said, it depends on how advanced your king is. If your king can actually get there in time, then you're just going to be able to win the pawn. But a really cool thing happens if your king's not in the way, not active, and your opponent's pawn is on one of the rook files. You can actually do this really cool move where you actually cut off the rook, cut off the king from protecting the pawn. Sorry. Now you see we've created a barrier here for the king, so they can't really do anything. So they can try push their pawn, and if the rook moves, and then the king can just follow and keep pushing the pawn. However, white doesn't actually have to do anything. You could potentially make some waiting moves, but then black's going to make the same waiting moves, and you're not making any progress. But you're actually going to bring your king in. So you're threatening to get your king involved and pick up this pawn with your king. If black keeps making some waiting moves. So black's going to try keep pushing this pawn with a3. And now you see the pawn's actually like two squares away from the king, which is quite crucial because after we go now rook g3, hitting the pawn, the king can't actually move into to cover the pawn. which means they have to push a2 in order to not get captured straight away. At which point, a simple rook a3 wins a pawn after the promotion. And life's just good for white. So this really interesting sort of maneuver of barricading out the king is quite useful when the pawns on one of the rook files, the A or the H file. It's important to note that it doesn't quite work if it's on any other file, because the king can sort of go to the other side and use the pawn as a sort of walking fortress. So they're able to sort of promote a bit more. At that point, you would need to get your king in the game. But this is just a cool little scenario of how you would sort of get around stopping the pass pawn if it's on the rook file. But yeah, on to the next situation. So in this situation, I've made a bit of a hypothetical here. We have no white king on the board. And what we're going to do, we're going to imagine there's some imaginary barricade stopping the black king getting any closer to this pawn, just for the sake of learning a cool technique. And with this barricade up, magical barricade, we have to decide what the result is. And it's actually more complicated than you think. It should be a draw if black knows the correct technique. So let's find out what that correct technique is. If you move the rook, that's probably fine and you're just shuffling. But if you try and move, black tries to move their king. Let's say they move their king upwards. At this point, white has this check. And you can see now they've actually just gained a tempo here. And the black king can come in and attack this rook. But now you've cleared the way for the promotion square while still covering it with your rook. So a promotion is going to actually win you the game. So we know that the black king can't move up to any of these three squares. We know these bottom squares also are cut off from the rook already. So what happens if they move forward? Now, if the black king decides to move forward and actually go after this pawn, regardless of the invisible barrier, white has this really cool technique, and they actually sacrifice the pawn by going rook to h8. And you might think this just draws the game immediately because rook takes b7. But after the rook checks on h7, it's a little x-ray skewer, pin, whatever, and they take the rook on b7. So that's a really cool little tactic, and it's something to keep in mind. So we know now the king can't go to any of these squares. So now they're left with king to h7. Now this hasn't gone upwards, so there's no behind checks, and this hasn't gone to f7, so there's no flank checks. So now we know that this is a safe square for the king. So we know that if the king can shuffle between the g7 and h7 squares, then it's going to be completely safe from the threat of white promoting. So this is actually a draw, but it's important for both sides to know the techniques that white could possibly win with, which is really important and happens a surprising amount because you just up a pawn, really. You're like, both players have a rook and you are just up a pawn. Obviously, if the king was on the board, you would try get your king over to defend the pawn. However, it's a magical scenario, you know. Imagine there's some other things happening that require the white king's attention or whatnot. But anyway, a really cool technique, and I think it's super important to know. So yeah, on to the next position. So this position here is a super famous position about rooks, rook and a pawn versus a rook as well, and how to actually promote this pawn. And it's called the Lucina position. Now, I'll tell you straight away, this is winning for white. And there is an opposite version of this sort of for black where you can draw. It's a bit different though, which we'll go on in the next example. But the whole problem here is that white's king can't actually get outside of this pawn at the minute. So they can't clear the way for the pawn to promote. Because of this rook and because of the proximity of this king, it makes life really awkward. So what's white going to do? They have to do this really cool check, rook to e1. The only move sort of that wins. You could probably shuffle a bit and get the similar position, but you would need to play rook to e1. And now the king can choose to do two things. Firstly, if it goes upwards towards a pawn, a king d8 is really nice. The rook can't come in and check. It doesn't have time to go behind. And if you go to c2, you can just promote, and white's winning straight away. So we know that doesn't work. So if they go back now, you see the king's further away. And now the white king actually has these squares to get out and push the pawn and clear the space for the pawn. So what's white's plan now? You've made this space, but as we've sort of seen before, the rook can sort of give these infinite checks if the king ever comes out from behind this pawn. So white actually has to take some initiative here and do something against these checks. So you actually go rook to e4. It's important to note that you can't actually get any closer than e4 because of this king. So you have to go to the 4th rank, basically. And after this, the king can do two things. They probably want to keep their rook here, just because it's stopping the king going to the other side. So they're probably going to move their king here. The king can actually come closer to f5, at which point rook c4. And black's made a bit of a bad situation for themselves. You can see king e6. We have this similar position to before, where we can go king to d8. Yes, they could give a check on d2 now, but after this, we've got a very similar position to before, where we can actually just promote with the rook behind the pawn, and there's nothing black can do. And if they go rook d2 here, cutting off, then we can just go to the other side. And after the check, our rook's actually made a barricade, so they can't check us anymore. And we are just free to promote this pawn on the next move. So king to f7 is the next best thing, really. At which point we're free to move to king d7. There's nothing stopping us now. The king has gone from e7 to f7 and cleared the path for our king. Now we are clearing the path for our pawn, and we are threatening promotion at any time. So the black rook now is going to try do their little tricks of the infinite checks, and it might seem like our rook's a bit too far away to actually block any of those checks. So it might look a bit dubious. However, we have a really cool sequence of moves with the white king to actually get to a position where the rook can cover us. So the rook's going to go for these checks here, like we've seen. And rather than go back again, we're actually staying sideways, going to d6. So we come up sort of behind the pawn here. And then we move sideways. And black's going to just keep checking. But now we actually have the time to move forward to king c5. And you can see now the purpose of moving the rook to e4. If they try to check us again, we can actually just block that. And then we're free to promote. You know, they take or whatever, and we promote. Or they can go to the side, and then we just promote anyway. But yeah, this is a really cool position, and it comes from this rook to e4 with the king coming up. And it's important to know this sort of zigzag pattern in order to get your king out next to you, so your rook can actually come and block the checks. Which is really important to know, and it only sort of happens when the pawn's sort of on c7. You need the proximity to promotion. It's important to note as well, you want to keep the black king as far away as possible. The further away the black king is, the easier this position is going to be. And you just have to know a few lines if it's right next to you. But as we've seen, it's simple enough. So yeah, on to the next position. So the next couple of positions here are sort of the opposite of the Lucina position. This is called the Philidor position. And it's actually a way white can get a draw in this situation. So we'll see that the king's sort of cut off on the back rank, which is quite important. It's not necessary, I don't think, but it is quite important. And we can see that if white decides to not know the Philidor, decides to not know the Philidor position, you know, as you do, you decide to not know things, and plays a natural move similar to sort of pinning the pawn. Then the king's actually just coming in, and it's important to note you don't come in front of your pawn. You come into the side just so you can use the pawn as a barricade, and this just gets extremely nasty for white. And you can actually see black manages to get the Lucina position from this. They've got a few moves they need to do to make it the exact same, but it is going to be the same position with the same ideas. And you can see how a simple move that looks good, like pinning the pawn to the king, just doesn't work out. So you need to know this, and you need to be active about choosing to do this. And the key move is actually rook to b3, which seems strange. It seems like you're not actually stopping any of black's progress. However, what's black going to do here? They can shuffle a bit, they can give you some checks, but your king can always just dance on d1 and d2, regardless of the checks. And their king can't actually get any closer. All these squares are blocked off. So sort of black's only choice is to play d3. At which point, you've got this vital move you need to play as well. Back to b8. Back to as far away as you can go with the rook. And the whole purpose here is, yes, black could get forward, but now you actually have an infinite series of checks you can do on the king. And where are they going to go? You know, they can't do anything about this. And if they go too far away, you could obviously win get the trade off and then win the pawn, or you could just go back and hit the pawn here, and you're going to be winning that pawn. But you see this infinite series of checks is extremely, extremely nasty. And there's nothing black can actually do to sort of avoid this. They get closer, you just go back to the pawn, and their king's on the other side of the board all of a sudden. So, what are the key sort of identifiers of this position? The pawn and the king need to be on the 4th rank. They can't be any further than that. Your king also needs to sort of be in front of the pawn and blockading the promotion square at least. The rook doesn't have to be cutting it off, I don't think. But yeah, that's the key move, and it needs to be your move, and you need to claim the 3rd rank, sorry. If black manages to claim the 3rd rank first, it's probably going to be winning for them. So you need to be active, and you need to say, no, this is mine, and make them play this d3 move, which is going to give you the infinite series of checks. Now, the Philidor position does have some exceptions. This is one of them, and it's still actually drawing for white. And you still could use the Philidor position in this, but you don't actually have to. You can use this more sort of passive defense, where you actually go back to rook to f1. And this works with both the knight pawn and the rook pawn as well, simply because it's just the same sort of corner ideas. And you can see now they could push the pawn, but we saw it's better for the king to come in. So we're going to move the king in. And basically what you can do is shuffle. You can shuffle as much as you want with this rook, whichever moves you want to do, obviously not sacking the rook on a1. And the whole point is they can't play around you. They can't go to the other side like they would be able to in the other situation, threatening some mate, threatening to win the rook, all that good stuff. And your rook controlling the first file is stopping them threatening mate on you. So they try to make progress now, and you can just keep shuffling. And then they might throw in this sort of g2, b2 check on the other side as well. This rook to g2 checks. And this is a really vital sort of moment for you, and you need to know this. Which way do you go? Which way do you go? And you can pause and sort of figure this out for yourselves. But it should be quite an easy one. You're in the corner already. That's what makes this special. You're in the corner. So you got to just stick to the corner. If you don't, king h2 just sort of wins. Rook g1's coming, and then you're just going to push the pawn, or you could go to f2, then push the pawn, stuff like that. It gets very nasty very quickly. So you're gonna play it smart. You're gonna stick to h1, and there's nothing really black can do to get you out of this corner. They could try check you, and then you just go back, and they'll just repeat. It's important to note here, they can't actually push this pawn in this situation because rook to c3, king moves, and you actually just win the game because they can't defend their rook anymore. But yeah, this is just a little exception. I think you still can use the Philidor rule here. Although it's important to note that the rook here couldn't actually control the third file because the pawn was actually controlling that as well. So you would have to use the passive sort of defense here and claim the first rank before black does, which is super important as well. But yeah, that's the Philidor position. It's not one that happens super often, but it's one you really need to know, because if you don't know it, they're able to get the Lucina position and win. So you need to be active, and you need to claim these files when you can and prevent the king from coming in as soon as you can, basically, which is great. So that's basically all it is about Rooks. I know there's not much, but to be honest, there isn't that much about Rooks. There is exceptions. There's tons and tons of exceptions, and I urge you all to sort of research it yourself. But these are the basic ones, and a lot of the exceptions are just slight differences on these sort of positions that you need to check out for yourselves. So yeah, onto the Queen endgames. So we're on to Queen versus Pawn endgames now. There aren't many endgames for Queens just because they're such a tricky piece. A lot of the endgames just boil down to tactics, but I've chosen this one because it's a really cool idea and it shows the creativity that the side with the pawn can have here. So we're just going to look at this technique here, and you might think this is instantly winning for black, and you would actually be right in this situation. It is instantly winning, but there are some really nice techniques here that black can use to create the win. So we'll just have a look at that, and the whole idea basically revolves around black getting their king over to the other side of the board so it can help the queen take this pawn. But how do we actually achieve that? Because white, as we've seen, can always threaten promotion. So basically you want to firstly get your queen as close as possible to this pawn, and you can do this through several ways. Always hitting the pawn, always covering the promotion, and trying to check as much as you can as well, until you basically get to this situation where you can get the king there and the queen there. So you're hitting both the pawn and checking the king. The only square the king can actually go to now is to d8, and at this point you have a free move, you have a free tempo, so you can spend that getting your king closer to the pawn. Now this happens on the other side as well. It's just the same position. But a weird thing happens when the king comes up to c7, and it's still completely winning, but you basically just have to put in a bit of work and recreate the position you had at the start. So you've got to go back a bit, give some more checks, get into the right position, always threaten the pawn, always threaten promotion, always check the king, until you get to the same position, at which point you can get the king across. And things might get a bit complicated when you get your king in the way, simply because you might be blocking off some squares for your queen. But there are lots of tactics like this pin here. White physically can't promote because of the pin. So you've got tons of tactics like that until you get the same position. The king comes in, you take the pawn, and checkmate. So we know that for the pawns on the D and the E, because they are the same, they are winning for black. So let's have a look at the B and the G pawns. Is it the same? You can try work it out, but I'll tell you now, it is exactly the same. All you need are the A and C squares available to give these nasty checks. So we can play this out. However, it's not particularly exciting. It's all the same sort of stuff. White is stuck behind their pawn. The king gets across. Very nasty indeed. Oh, no. It would help if I made the right move. Very nasty checks until you have the exact same sort of mate with the king coming across and winning the pawn. So now we know that the E, the D, the B, and the G files are all completely winning for black. And that sort of begs the question, is the C and the F any different? Are they the same? You still have the B and the D files, squares, to give the nasty checks. So are they the same? I'll let you guys sort of play this out yourself. It's a really nice one. And we can sort of go through the motions and get the king over there. We can keep doing the same sort of thing. And we'll get to this position, this nasty check. But then white's actually going to do this really cool move. So they're not actually going to go in front of their pawn. They're actually going to go over to A8, which is completely mind-blowing. they just sacrifice the pawn. But you'd see if queen takes, it's actually a stalemate for the white king, which is a crazy tactic. And at the same time, they're still threatening promotion. So how do you actually stop this? Well, black actually can't stop this. They have to go like to a6, at which point you get the same position. So this position on the F and on the C files is actually drawn. It's a forced draw for white versus a queen. That's 8 points of material difference, and it's a forced draw, which is mind-blowing. And this is so useful. Say if you've got a pawn race, and your opponent promotes one square quicker, but you know you're on the C or the F file, you know it's going to be a draw. So this is actually a forced draw, and there's nothing black can actually do about this. So now we know that the B, the D, the E, and the G are all winning, and the C and the F are all drawing. So that begs the question about the rook files, and the rook files we know from experience are all extremely tricky and are where all of the exceptions sort of hang around. And you can try work this out, but I think it's pretty clear that this is going to be a draw, simply because of some stalemating threats. You know, if the king goes back to a8, you don't have the tempo to move your king, because if you keep your queen here, it's actually just going to be a stalemate. The king's blocking the pawn, and the queen's stopping the king going anywhere else. So the queen actually has to move away, however that is, and it's just a stalemate. There's nothing black can do about it. It's a pretty simple one, to be fair. So now let's summarize all of these positions. The B, the D, the E, and the G file are all completely winning for black. And the H, the F, the C, and the A files are all drawing for white, which is crazy how a pawn versus queen is drawn half of the time if the pawn's one square away from promotion. Absolutely mind-blowing. Anyway, that's one of my favourite endgames. And to be honest, there's not much else about queens. I didn't want to put queens versus rooks in the endgame sort of playlist. I feel like that's like the queen versus rook checkmate. Firstly, it's way too complicated for a small segment. It would need its own video, and to be honest, I don't really know it. So that's about it for queens, because they often are just tactical things that win games rather than going into these boring sort of endgames. But anyway, thank you all for watching. I hope you all enjoyed the endgame series. I know I enjoyed going over it again. It definitely helped me out, relearning all of these things for you guys. And I hope you guys found something that you didn't know before. And if you didn't, I hope you all enjoyed the refresher anyway. But thank you all for watching. Please like if you liked. Please subscribe if you're alert. And I'll catch you guys all tomorrow. Bye-bye.